All right. So we were looking at the first few weeks of the project. First week, I would say. It won't be more than a week or so, the planning part. So broadly, what you do is you'll figure out who are the key people. You'll identify your activities and then prepare the detailed plans, right? So since you are the business analyst and manage the requirements, you'll contribute to all the requirement related planning. Okay, so we learned that as well. Then you also identify and establish frameworks for managing the requirements and scope, right? So that you are not over delivering or it's not hitting your profitability. All those would be a business analyst additional responsibility. So we learned those techniques, how to manage the scope by approvals and reviews, and then your traceability, change management. So all these techniques we have looked at. All right. So broadly, when you are signing off onto this planning phase, the project plan, there would be a document called as a project charter. Project charter would have all these details about how do you basically it gives you the terms of that particular project, right? Generally, this scope and change management also will be part of that. So you'll ensure that both the parties agree on what are the techniques for managing the changes and any changes to the scope. How are you going to manage that? You'll agree on that, like traceability template, change management template, all that will be agreed right up front. Okay. So and then you would sign off. So one thing I think we did not cover is risk management. Right? Now risk management is a very generic term. So I wouldn't say it's specific to IT projects. Forget about requirements. It's not even specific to IT projects. Anything, if you look at any project or even so, this risk management approach will give you as a framework. So briefly we'll look at it, and then we'll discuss the case study as well. So that way we will be clear about what is expected out of us in the planning phase. Okay. So today's session will cover these two topics. If time permits, I'll start the next topic as well. Otherwise, we'll start. You can figure out there are multiple risks. Now, the reason I'm searching them is because I don't want to give a laundry list to you, because risk would be specific to a particular project. So I would not say these 5 risks would be there for every project. So that would be too naive to do that, I would say. Right? Because risks are always context specific. So for one project it might be a risk, another project it might not be a big risk. Right? Now, when you are working in a particular project, right? So you need to figure out what are all the risks that my project faces. Right? You look specifically through the requirements, like maybe the requirements are not stable, are not very clear, or there is a possibility that the SME could change. So in that case, if the SME leaves the organization, right? So you obviously will be in a trouble, because somebody else gave you the requirements and somebody else would come and test it out. Okay? So there are multiple kind of risks which would be relevant, and the risk could come in at any point in time. It's not that at the start of the project you identify all the risks for the project, and there would be once you put in a plan, that is good. Right? A new risk could come in when you are in the design phase, or a new risk could come in when you are even in the testing phase. Right? So it's an ongoing continuous activity. So risk management is also an ongoing continuous activity. You could get risk at any point in the project. Right? So you will have to identify the risk first. Okay. So as and when the risk comes in, you would list that to the list of all the risks that you have, and maintain a tracker, risk tracker or something like that, which basically has all the risk for your project. Right? So this is a continuous process, and requirement risks are a subset of your overall project risk. Right? So that's a first step. You are listing down all your risks. Right? So primarily the responsibility of risk management will be with the project manager, but he would expect you to contribute to all the requirement related risks. If something related to requirements or the business side, if there is a risk, you have to clearly identify that and then ensure that the project manager is aware of it as well. So, step one is basically listing down all the risk and adding as and when it becomes relevant. Now, you have, let's say, some 20 risk or 30 risk which you have identified. Now, are all of them equal? So, do they need to be of equal importance? Not really. Some of them might be very important for us. Some of them you feel that it's not even relevant. Some risk would be high risk, some would be low risk. Now, how do we identify which one is high risk, which one is low risk? Okay? So we cannot just say, okay, this is high risk or low risk. Broadly, what we do is we look at these two parameters for assessing a risk, for classifying whether it is high or low. The probability of the event happening, or the likelihood, the chance, right? Is there a very high chance or a low chance or a medium chance, right? Or you could provide it as a percentage number, like there's a 20% chance, 50% chance, 90% chance, right? So giving what is the probability that the risk could happen, right? There's a 50% chance that the SME could leave, or there is a 90% chance that these requirements could change. Okay, so that could be the kind of that's likelihood, right? So that's one parameter. The second one is the impact. Now, what we mean by impact is, let's say the risk happens, right? So now that particular risk has happened, like the SME has left. Now, what is the loss for you if the SME left? If he is the only person who understands that requirement, that's a really huge loss. But if there are like hundreds of such people, if this guy leaves, another person can come in from the next day, not a big deal, right? So you don't even care about that person, right? So the impact would change depending on the situation there. Obviously, the risk is of higher priority. Delayed because of that, then that is a big risk, right? So you want to make sure that you don't want to lose even one day. So the risk of the cyclone becomes much higher. Why? Because the impact is increased, right? So the likelihood is the same, right? So there is a 50% chance of the cyclone happening, but if the cyclone happens, I am screwed up. So the impact is really high, right? So that increases the risk score. There could be another project where the cyclone happening, the likelihood is still 50%, but I can move the project timelines by 2 more days. So it's not so aggressive. I don't really need to complete it by that particular date. Right? In case a cyclone happens, maybe we'll lose a couple of days time, so we'll postpone it. Right? So even if I go live after 2 days, it's not a big deal for me. I'm okay with it. Right? So obviously, the risk score would become much less because the impact is low. Right? So the same risk could have multiple risk scores, or based on your context of the project. So all you have to do is figure out your risk, and then looking at that particular context, figure out whether it's a high priority, medium priority, or low priority risk. Sometimes you'll have that scale of 1 to 5, or sometimes 1 to 3. Whatever it is, it makes sure that you are aligning to that. Okay, that's the second step, which is assessment of the risk. Once you do the assessment, then you'd come up with a mitigation strategy. Now, what mitigation strategy basically tells us is that how are you going to manage this risk? What is the plan? How are you going to address this risk? Right? So that's covered as part of your mitigation strategy. So broadly, your response would fall into these 3 options. Right? We are going to avoid that risk completely. So this is something like buying the insurance. Yeah. Okay. So talking about the mitigation risk. So broadly, there would be these three types: avoid, contingent, and assume. Now, avoid basically means you're transferring that risk, or you're putting in a place wherein the chances of that risk happening or the impact of that risk is completely zero. Right? So even if the risk happens, there is no loss that you're incurring. But that means that there has to be a plan upfront. Right? So you have to spend some money or spend some effort in ensuring that there is a plan already in place even before the risk occurs. Right? So those kind of plans we call it as avoid. Right? So usually, there would be some cost involved in the avoid strategy right up front, even before the risk happens. But it would contain the losses after the risk happens. So this is something similar to like buying an insurance. Right? If something goes wrong, the insurance guy would compensate for the loss. So your risk priority would become less for you now. Right? So you're saying that I'll buy an insurance for this. You're not able to deliver this project by end of this year, then the insurance company will pay for it. So maybe the project would become not so important for you. So the impact is less even if you miss the timelines. All right, so that's the first one. The second one is a contingent option. It's more like the plan B. Right? So after the risk happens, you would say that if the risk happens, then I will take a different approach, and we call that as a plan B. Right? So plan B is generally triggered when after the risk happens. Right? So let's say let's consider this example of a resource, your dependent resource leaving. Right? The SME is giving you the requirements and is leaving. The first strategy, avoid, would mean that there is a chance that this person could leave. So I will hire another person, and then I will involve two people in this project right from the start. Right? So obviously, there is some additional cost because rather than pay for one person, you are paying for two people. You could have avoided that. Right? So that's basically the avoid strategy, where there are where you have put in that contingent the mitigation plan upfront. We call that as a avoid strategy. The second one is contingents. So here you are saying that I'll start with one SME, and if the that SME puts in his paper, then within the next 1 week before he leaves, I'll get another resource, and then ensure that the KT is done, and then the first person can leave the organization. So the cost for this is comparatively less compared to the avoid strategy, but again you're losing some time again here. So you're losing a week's time or so. Okay. So the third type of mitigation strategy is assume. So wherein now you're saying that yeah.
I have a question. I didn't actually get contingent. Can you explain that one more time?
Okay. So contingent is like only if the risk happens, then I will execute the mitigation strategy. Right. So example, there is a if you pick up the first risk, let's say there is a resource dependency, and that person could leave. Okay. Now. Mm-hmm. If you are going with an avoid strategy, what you would feel is, okay, if this guy leaves, there is a big hit on my project, so I'll hire another person. I'll keep two people rather than one person. So that becomes your avoid strategy, right? Mm-hmm. The second one is contingent, which means only if the risk happens, then I'll enforce the plan B, right? Okay. So plan B is what? I'll bring in another resource only when this guy leaves. Otherwise, I'll cover with one guy. So upfront, there is no cost in a contingency plan. Only if the risk happens, there is some cost, right? But there is some downside also, that you're losing some time there. Okay, so that's your contingency. The third one is basically you're writing it off and then moving on. Okay, so you're saying that these risks, it's not too big a risk. I don't want to put in a plan or even a contingent plan. If it happens, let it happen. I'll write off that loss and then move on. So that's the approach which is taken in a Zoom. Example, let's say there's a cyclone which could happen. Okay, now if the cyclone happens, maybe you lose a couple of days of time. That's because the offices would be shut and then you cannot work further. Right? So if you want to, all you can do is it's not a big deal. I'll lose 2 days. I'll write off that 2 days and then move on. Right? But if you have to actually have a plan in place, then you'll have the disaster recovery and backup plan, business continuity plan should be there, and you'll have to move resources to another location. There will be too much of cost. Why that hassles? I don't want to spend anything. Only if the risk happens, then I'm losing some couple of days. So let that happen. So I'll just assume it. So you're not even planning for that risk because it's not so important to you. Okay? So that's the other strategy. Okay. So usually, you'd cap a requirement risk register would have these 3 things. You'd have the list of risks, then you'd have a priority, high, low, medium, and then your mitigation strategy. How are you going to manage that risk? Okay, and this is a continuous activity. You will keep on reviewing, tracking, and taking that action on a continuous basis. It's not like only during the planning phase you will do it and then leave it. So that won't really work. Okay. Yeah. So that is generally what we do as part of our planning, right? Not so complicated topic, right? So most of the time we contribute to the project plan, and you have to just inquire: is there a change management plan? Is there a traceability metrics? All those templates you will figure out and agree with the customer, right? So just make sure that when you are getting into the project and then during the planning phase, are all these templates identified, and then you have them handy with you. Okay, that's all what you need to do. All right, it's very simple.